start talking to you about creating a team of joint product owners. So this is an idea that I've been thinking about for a little while and wanted to find sort of a venue to get feedback on this. So this is primarily my goal here is to tell you some thoughts that are kind of swishing around in my head, and then ideally I would love feedback, whether you want to like send me a tweet or send me an email or something like that. I'm really interested to hear what you all think. So the main kind of problem that I want to talk about solving here is getting engineering teams to work collaboratively with product where it doesn't feel like requirements are being thrown over a wall, and instead it feels like a true collaboration between those two functions. So with that, let's talk about this as being a story fundamentally about managers and ICs. So of course, I'm going to kind of lump a bunch of these managers together. Like there's you could have a CEO in a small startup, or you could have an engineering manager or a product manager. These are all sort of, I'm going to talk about all these folks as sort of managers. And then there's data scientists and designers and engineers who I think are kind of all in a cluster of sort of technical ICs that help bring a product to life. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to refer to managers as sort of star managers. Because first of all, for me personally, my career has mostly been a confused identity of being like both an engineering manager and a product manager. So this it simplifies things for me and makes me happy, and this is my talk, so I get to do that if I want to. But the other reason is that fundamentally I think there's kind of a manager archetype as it relates to engineers that is consistent across whether you're a CEO or a PM or an engineering manager. So it's worthwhile to sort of collapse that to have the discussion. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about what a traditional view of this sort of collaboration flow looks like. The manager owns the product and kind of the vision behind the product and the requirements for the product, and the engineer provides the implementation, right? Sounds pretty familiar. And you can sort of think about this as that, like, the model that, like, Google or Twitter or LinkedIn, whoever use for developing products, right? And you kind of have your engineering manager owning the technical vision, and your engineer owning the technical vision, the engineering manager owning kind of the team and building the team culture, and the product manager specifying what you build. The problem is this can devolve into something that looks kind of like this. And the problem here is kind of deeper than just, you could say, oh, well, I'm going to write a great spec, and then I'm going to be around to answer questions. But that's not good enough. Your engineers actually have to really understand what you're building, why you're building, and who you're building it for, and kind of be like miniature PMs in their own right. Otherwise, they're not going to know how to interpret the requirements that you write, because language is really just kind of a placeholder for like kind of like deeper sort of knowledge, right? Get a little bit too philosophical there, but you can sort of think about people who could read a requirement and misinterpret it because they just lack the context in the industry. So we're all working in fintech, which has like a pretty deep bench of domain expertise required in many of the areas where we work, right? So I think it's really, really important that you bring your teams along, or if you're an engineer, that you're kind of demanding that level of insight such that you can properly interpret requirements. And of course, on the manager side, if you're sort of just spitting out like lots of detailed requirements, it's going to be really hard to get those right if you don't have somewhat of a technical background. So you can kind of think about, in this classical model, there's like implementation and specification. And I think those are the wrong axes to sort of think about kind of engineers versus product managers. So I think what you end up wanting to do is figure out ways to empower ICs. And so you think about sort of satisfying constraints versus setting constraints, or kind of focusing on details versus focusing on the big picture or the vision as sort of maybe more reasonable axes. They're probably not ideal, but you can sort of starting to think about that direction. Now, why do I care about this? And particularly, why am I thinking about sort of details versus vision? Well, I think about products as being the result of choices that we make on our way to building something. And sorry, the slides got a little bit distorted, so things might not be super easy to read. But basically, you can think of there being a spectrum from micro to macro decisions that get made as you build a product, right? Like the biggest decision that you make is, what am I building? Who am I building it for? Right? Kind of like these really, really big kind of in-scope problems. And those are things that I think have to come from sort of a product manager or the CEO or sort of some sort of management person who can create sort of a frame, right? Otherwise, I think there are cases where I've seen sort of engineers get sort of lost. Like, oh, you want me to like solve if it's just like solve a problem for SMBs, like that's like so vague, right? So obviously you can't throw somebody kind of in the deep end there. But as you sort of think about like the decision scope, and as you move to like finer grained decisions, it's not just that those decisions are more detail oriented, but they also become more frequent. So you maybe only decide who you're building your product for once, or maybe like you refine that vision once a year or something like that, right? But there are literally going to be thousands of little decisions that you have to make, that an engineer in particular will have to make when they're actually implementing some product spec. And if they don't have the right context, either they're going to be kind of coming back to this product manager and asking them for question, kind of for clarification every like 5 times, 10 times a day, right? And it's going to create this really slow round trip process, or they're just going to kind of guess, and that's also probably not great. So I sort of think of this as breaking down to these 3 scenarios. So you could give an engineer like an incredibly detailed spec that's like 50 pages long and has all the things that you think that they could ever possibly need. The problem is that it's not going to be right, first of all. And this is because you can't have, PMs can't just push data to engineering teams. There also needs to be a process of pulling data out of the PM, if that makes sense. And you also don't want the engineer just to kind of make it up as they go. That's probably not going to build a product that your customers want to buy. So the real answer here is to create a reasonably scoped specification and then give context to the engineer such that they can make the micro decisions on their own. So I kind of think about this as like being a modern view where managers and engineers co-own the product. Managers focus on the coarse-grained kind of vision and specification, but engineers actually have ownership over that finer-grained specification. And so how do you do this? Well, first of all, you make the customer really a friendly face to your engineering team. So just taking your engineering team like out into the field with you when you go meet with prospective customers or actual customers, bringing those customers into the office to chat with your team, stuff like that, super valuable. I think it's somewhat common in startups to a certain degree because those roles are so condensed. As companies get bigger, you tend to sort of see more of these barriers between those functions. And I think it can do a fair amount of harm. The other thing that I think is really important is actually collaboratively writing requirements. So the way that I usually like to do this is I'll start with a kind of like purposefully underspecified like product requirement document, and then send that out to the team and say like, what's missing? What else do you want to see? What else are you thinking about? Does this seem kind of directionally right to you? And then you get a bunch of comments or possibly like inline contributions to that document, and then you refactor it and then you send it back out, and you kind of do this loop a couple times. And at the end, you have a document that's actually been co-authored by the entire team. So there's, buy-in, and there's also sort of a guarantee, or maybe not guarantee is maybe too strong a word, but a strong suspicion that there is a good technical basis for the things that you're proposing building. And then, of course, the manager is available as an oracle to answer kind of questions that come up. So all of this has an implication for me is how I think about hiring engineers. And so for me, I think about the best engineers being folks who can actually do all 3 of these things, not just kind of sit and primarily on that one kind of engineering function. It's really about hiring people who are highly cross-functional and can wear that PM hat. So that's kind of the thing that I've been thinking about. I can't tell yet if this is like a totally obvious point that everybody else is just kind of like, well, like how else would you do it? Or if people think this is like in any way controversial. I'm not sure. So curious for any like thoughts or questions or feedback on that.
Thanks. I enjoyed this perspective. How do you think about ownership or accountability in this framework? Like if it's co-ownership, then who's responsible at the end of the day if business, metrics aren't met?
Yeah, so I think the question becomes like, why is the business metric not met? So I think maybe a really simple way to break that down might be to say the PM or the sort of the star manager owns the kind of big picture, like vision of what did we prioritize kind of like at the macro scale, and did we build like totally the wrong product or generally the right product, or kind of what outcome looked like there. And then of course within sort of a product requirement kind of spec, for example, you probably have a bunch of like P0 features that you think are really important, and you might what I would often do is assign an engineer to say, hey, like this feature is your feature to go kind of like own and implement end to end. And so then kind of at that smaller scale, the ownership is on the engineer to ask the right questions, provide a good implementation, things like that. So I sort of think about splitting it up similar kind of to that chart, like along the scale. Back in the back.
Actually, more of a question. What do you think is the most difficult of these dimensions to get your teams to meaningfully contribute to?
It's a good question. I think it's probably somewhat of a tie between team and product. I mean, I think most engineers, or whether if you're a designer, sort of thinking about kind of design systems and things like that, are already kind of ingrained in how you think about your job. The hard thing is getting people to do stuff that's a little bit outside of what they would normally think about as their kind of functional obligation. So when I hire engineers, I actually look for people who over-index in product thinking. That's actually like somewhat capable. You can sort of screen for that in like interviews. It's actually way harder to screen for people who are going to be really good with a team. That could be a whole separate talk about like how do you hire engineers who are really effective at making their team more productive. If that makes sense.
I'm curious to find out, you talk about the managers and you all talk about engineers. What about sales and business development within the company?
Great question. So I generally think of sales and BD as being probably relevant on two levels. It's a really good question. So I think definitely in the traditional model, they're sort of like, sales and BD will go talk to the PM and give input there, and then that kind of gets fanned out to the team. I think that's a reasonable model, especially because, how do I put this? Salespeople are very good at being aggressive, and that is not always the best thing when you have them interface with an engineering team. So that's something that you want to be cautious about. That being said, there's definitely cases where I think you can have salespeople who can sort of act as oracles for certain aspects of your product potentially, especially in a smaller organization.
You said something I thought was really interesting about language and how we can use the same language, but we have underlying different understandings of it. How do you, and since vision is the main overhaul of everything, how do you screen that the engineer you're working with understands the vision as you yourself see it?
So I think there's a couple sort of like techniques that you can use for this sort of thing. So of course, like the kind of the simple way that you solve this problem in a very generic sense is you kind of get people to parrot things back to you, and then you sort of see if that matches. And so in fact, I've coached engineers before who are having trouble working with other people. Hey, it seems like you two seem to always kind of talk past one another. Have you tried like just repeating back what the person said to you just to make sure that you got it right and sort of frame it that way for them? And I think you can try to do somewhat similar things. So for example, one thing I did not cover in this deck or talk was that after that product requirement document is co-authored, I then like to have an engineer kind of tech lead the implementation of that. And that generally the first step there is going and writing a technical design document. And so if you are technically literate enough as the kind of manager, you can go in and read that document and say, does this implementation spec match the requirement spec? And so did we sort of get us, did something get mixed up in that process, or does it seem mostly aligned? So that's probably the most common way, but it's a good question. I'm sure there are other good ways to approach that problem too. One more in the back there. Okay.
Does the process ever feel heavy for any of the folks that you work with, like the engineers in particular, and you get pushback from that perspective?
So the question was, does the process feel heavy, and do the engineers working within the system, and do you ever get pushback on that? I don't think so, but you'd have to ask them, right? I think this is actually a much lighter weight process than having. I think when I'm talking about these like product requirement documents, for example, I'm really talking about 2-page documents or maybe 5-page documents. These are not large, long specs. I've shipped pretty substantial features off of like a 5-page product spec or something like that. So I think it's actually lighter than kind of getting the waterfall style, like everything has been figured out for you in this like huge document form. Yes.
So where has this process gone wrong, or where have you had to tweak it to get it back on course?
Great question. So the question was, where has this process gone wrong, or where have we had to tweak it to get it kind of back on course? So there's a couple of situations where you can go wrong. So one is if your spec is way too light and you just don't include enough sort of like framing for what you're trying to accomplish. I think engineers can feel a little bit adrift and not be sure like, hey, I'm supposed to kind of be the tech lead on this feature, but like there's all these things that are underspecified about it. And so you have to make sure that the failure mode is both that you can sort of underspecify initially, but you can also kind of under-encourage engineers to query you heavily and sort of pull that information out of you as like the product manager or as the kind of product owner. And so I think that really probably the biggest failure mode is having folks who assume that the document is enough and don't do the like really interactive, iterative process, if that makes sense. Sometimes that requires some push because you can end up like you write up a spec document, you like paste it into your Slack channel or you send it to an email thread, and then like, do you get everybody like in there like commenting and doing stuff with the document, or does it just sit there, right? And I think if you have a culture where the document just sits there and it doesn't become sort of this living record of conversation, and instead people are sort of just like stopping in the hallway and being like, oh, I had this idea, and they're not like putting it in a comment in the doc instead, that creates a failure mode. Because then those discussions are not captured, and the document is kind of not really being that useful, if that makes sense.
I think we have time for one more quick one.
Okay. Looks like there's 2 hands raised right now. Right. Go for it.
Just to say, I would consider this to be more of a collaborative process. And the reason I'm saying that is because I like this because you can use an XP, Scrum, trying to do scale that to framework, whatever. And you can still, as a product manager or engineering manager, you can think in these terms and apply this approach to those processes. And you can evaluate the processes that you're doing now according to this approach. You can troubleshoot your problems in your current process with this approach in mind. And I think you can design a better process with this approach. For example, you were talking about process just now about how do people get together specifically to co-create documents.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the process. Where do they meet, when, how long, what's the tool they use? You can design that type of process in a lightweight managed company, but if you have this approach in mind, you're going to probably end up with a better process than if you have your old traditional approach in mind as a seasoned manager. You'll probably bring people down the wrong path towards more waterfall and more that design and implement separation. So I think this is a useful thing to apply to any process.
It makes total sense. So the comment was basically that this is more of a, is more of approach than a process, and this is a approach that could be applied to any number of like engineering processes, which I think I agree with that. That makes total sense to me. Cool.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Hand those